There's a specific kind of silence that happens when you're watching someone eulogize you, and they don't know you're in the room. It's not angry, it's not even sad exactly. It's something colder than both of those things. Something that sits in your chest like a stone that's been there so long it's become part of your anatomy. I was sitting in the third row of my mother's dining room, in a chair I'd pulled back just far enough from the table to stay out of the candlelight. 14 people were there. My mother, Nora, was at the far end, dabbing her eyes with a cloth napkin she'd been clutching since before the appetizers were cleared. Cousins I hadn't seen in years. My father's old business partner, two men I didn't recognize, who I'd later find out were connected to the sale. And at the head of the table, holding a glass of red wine like he was accepting an award, was my brother Declan. He was mid-speech, something about resilience, something about honoring legacy, something about how hard the last few years had been, and how proud our father, Holt Mercer, dead 3 years now, would have been to see what the family had preserved. He said the word family 4 times in 90 seconds. I counted. Nobody at that table knew I was there except the man sitting next to me, my lawyer, who had driven 2 hours to be in that chair and had not touched his food. Declan raised his glass, the table raised theirs. My mother whispered something that sounded like thank you and pressed the napkin to her mouth. I didn't raise anything. I just watched him. I watched the way his shoulders sat easy, the way his jaw was relaxed, the way his eyes moved around the table collecting gratitude like it was a tax he was owed. He had no idea, and I had spent 6 months making sure of that. My father, Holt Mercer, was not a warm man. He was precise, disciplined, the kind of man who showed up 40 minutes early to everything and considered punctuality a moral position. He built Hartwell Logistics Group out of a single leased warehouse, 2 trucks he couldn't fully afford, and a client list he kept in a physical notebook that he locked in his desk drawer every night before he left. No digital backup, no cloud storage, just a man and a notebook, and the absolute conviction that if you did the work correctly, the work would hold. He died of a heart attack on a Tuesday morning, sitting at his desk, coffee still hot. I was 31. Declan was 28. The will was straightforward. The business went to both of us, but the incorporation, the original paperwork my father had filed 17 years earlier when Declan and I were still kids, listed one name as the founding owner, mine, Zane Mercer. My father had told me this when I turned 25, quietly, in the parking lot after a family dinner. He didn't make it a moment. He just said it the way he said most things, like it was a fact that had always existed and didn't require ceremony. The business is yours, Zane. I built it for you. Declan will land somewhere. I never told Declan that conversation happened. Looking back, that was my first mistake. After Holt died, Declan and I ran Hartwell together, and for a while it worked. I handled operations, contracts, vendor relationships, route optimization, and the infrastructure that kept 32 employees paid on time. Declan handled the front end, client meetings, networking, the handshakes, and the dinners, and the version of himself he'd been perfecting since he was 17. He was good at it. I'll give him that. Declan could walk into a room where nobody knew him, and walk out with 3 business cards and a standing lunch invitation. We were functional. Not equal, I always knew the weight wasn't distributed evenly, but functional. The friction was always the same. Declan wanted more credit than he'd earned. Not publicly, exactly. It was subtler than that. It was the way he'd reference his client relationships in front of vendors who knew I'd built the contracts. The way he'd let silence sit when someone assumed the company had been his idea. The way he'd accept compliments for things I'd done without correcting anyone, and then look at me afterward with an expression that wasn't quite guilt and wasn't quite defiance. Something in between that I could never fully name. I told myself it was just ego, that it was manageable, that it was the tax you paid for having a brother who needed to feel like he mattered. Then, 14 months after our father's funeral, I fell asleep behind the wheel on Route 9 heading home from a supplier meeting. I didn't wake up for 23 days, and Declan got to work. The first thing I noticed when I woke up was the ceiling. Hospital acoustic tile. The kind with the small perforated holes that you find yourself counting when there's nothing else to do. I counted them for a long time before I understood where I was. Before I understood that the thing attached to my left arm was an IV. Before I understood that the reason my mouth felt like wet concrete was that I hadn't used it in 23 days. Nora was in the chair beside me. She grabbed my hand the moment my eyes opened and said my name twice. Zane. Zane. In a voice that sounded like it had been wrung out and hung to dry too many times. She looked smaller than I remembered, like she'd been compressed by something heavy while I was gone. Declan arrived 40 minutes later. He hugged me carefully, like I was something fragile he was afraid of breaking. He smelled like cologne and coffee. His eyes were wet at the corners when he pulled back, and he held my face in both hands for a moment and said, "I thought I lost you, man. I thought I actually lost you." I believed him. That's the part that still sits wrong in my stomach when I think about it. Not the forgery, not the money, not the legal fiction he constructed while I was unconscious and breathing 3 rooms away from where he was making phone calls. The part that sits wrong is that I believed him. The coldness came gradually. Not from Nora. She stayed warm, stayed present, stayed the version of my mother I recognized. It came from everyone else. Aunts who visited once and didn't come back. Cousins who sent cards and then went quiet. My father's old business partner, a man named Roy who'd known me since I was 9, who called once while I was still in the hospital and spoke to me in the careful, measured tone you use with someone you've been warned about. I noticed it, but I couldn't name it yet. I was still in physical therapy, still relearning how to walk a straight line without listing to the left, still getting headaches that started behind my right eye and radiated outward until I had to sit in a dark room with a cold cloth on my face. I didn't have the bandwidth to investigate the temperature of family relationships, but small things accumulated. A cousin's wife who changed the subject when I mentioned coming back to the business. Nora mentioned offhand that Declan had held everything together in a tone that implied I hadn't. A family dinner 2 months after discharge, where 3 people asked me how I was really doing. Not physically, but really, with a weight behind the word that I didn't understand until much later. Declan had been busy while I was gone, not just with the business, with the narrative. I found out exactly what he'd said through the least dramatic possible channel. A text message from my cousin Priya, sent at 11:40 on a Wednesday night, that just said, "Hey, I think you should know what people were told when you were in the hospital. Call me when you can." I called her the next morning. She talked for 40 minutes. I said almost nothing. Declan had told the family, told Roy, told 2 of our longest-standing clients, and told our mother's sister that the accident wasn't really an accident in the way everyone was framing it. That I'd been under enormous self-inflicted pressure. That I'd been struggling for a long time. That the coma was, in his words, probably my body finally forcing me to stop. And that he was worried, deeply worried, that if I came back to the business too fast, the same thing would happen again. He'd said it quietly, carefully, with his eyes wet and his voice low. The way he'd learned made people lean in instead of push back. He didn't say I was unstable directly. He didn't have to. He just planted the seed in the right soil and watered it every time someone asked how I was doing. By the time I walked out of that hospital, half my family was already grieving a version of me that Declan had invented. And the other half was watching me carefully, waiting for the version he'd described to show up. I went home. I sat in my kitchen for a long time, and then I started paying attention. I didn't go looking for a smoking gun. I went looking for a discrepancy. One number that didn't line up, one date that sat wrong. That's all I needed to start pulling the thread. The company accountant was a man named Felix who had worked with my father for 11 years and had the energy of someone who had been uncomfortable about something for a very long time and was waiting for the right person to ask. I took him to lunch. I didn't accuse anyone of anything. I just asked him to walk me through the last 2 years of financials like I was new. Felix ordered a coffee, looked at the table for a moment, and then opened his laptop. The skimming wasn't even hidden well. Declan had been pulling money from the operational accounts in increments small enough to avoid automatic flags, but consistent enough that when you laid 18 months of statements side by side, the pattern was a straight line, somewhere between $60,000 and $80,000, routed through a vendor account that, when I looked it up, didn't have a registered address. That was the first document. The second one I found myself in was at 2 in the morning, in my father's old filing cabinet that Declan had apparently forgotten existed. The original power of attorney, notarized, dated 4 days after my accident, signed with my signature, except I'd been unconscious for 4 days by then. I sat with that paper in my hand for a long time. The third document was the one that turned my stomach completely over. The business incorporation, original, filed under one name, mine. Declan had never been a legal owner of Hartwell Logistics Group. Not for a single day. I found the sale documents by accident. I'd been going through the forwarded mail that had been accumulating at my old address, the address still listed on the business registration. The one Declan had apparently forgotten to update because he'd been too busy constructing a dead man's estate to handle administrative details. Most of it was junk. Vendor newsletters, a renewal notice, 2 pieces of IRS correspondence addressed to the estate of Zane Mercer that I almost set aside before the phrase registered in my brain and pulled me back to the table. I opened them slowly. The first letter was a routine audit notice, flagging irregularities in Hartwell's filed returns across 3 consecutive years. Standard language, bureaucratic and cold. The second letter was not routine. It was a follow-up, addressed specifically to the estate's representative, Declan, listed as executor, requesting documentation to support deductions that the IRS had flagged as potentially fraudulent. The letter referenced specific filing dates, specific amounts, specific categories of expense that didn't align with the business's reported operations. Every single flagged filing had been submitted after my accident. Every single one bore the authorization signature of the estate's representative, but the liability, written plainly in IRS language that didn't soften anything, sat entirely with the estate, with the dead man, with me. Declan hadn't just stolen the business. He'd been using my corpse as a shield. I set the letters down and opened my laptop. It took me 20 minutes to find the sale. Hartwell Logistics Group, listed quietly through a regional business broker, asking price redacted, but the deal structure was visible enough to understand its shape. Acquiring party, Cole Weston, through a holding entity. Projected close date, 19 days from the Tuesday I was sitting at my kitchen table in a house Declan thought belonged to a dead man. 19 days. I did the math without meaning to. 19 days until the business is transferred. Until the money moved. Until every forged document got buried inside an acquisition that would take years to untangle. Until the IRS investigation had nowhere to go except directly at an estate that existed only because my brother had needed somewhere to park his crimes. I closed the laptop. I picked up my phone and called a lawyer. Not a family lawyer. Not someone who knew the Mercer name. Someone who had never heard of any of us. Her name was Renata Voss. 45, no nonsense. The kind of lawyer who didn't write things down during consultations because she didn't need to. She listened to everything I said without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for exactly 4 seconds before she said, "You have more than enough. The question is sequencing." That word, sequencing, became the architecture of the next 2 weeks. We moved in a specific order because the order mattered. One wrong step, and Declan would feel the vibration, call Pierce Hadley, and start shredding. The forgery would disappear. The vendor account would close. The sale would accelerate, and I would spend the next 3 years in litigation trying to prove I was alive to a court system that had paperwork suggesting otherwise. So we didn't move fast. We moved correctly. The first call Renata made was to Agent Dara Solano. I wasn't on that call. Renata handled it alone, which was intentional. We weren't accusing anyone yet. We were presenting documents to an investigator who already had an open inquiry and needed to know that the estate she'd been corresponding with had a living, breathing owner who had never authorized a single filing she'd received. Renata faxed over 17 pages. Solano called back in under 2 hours. The investigation didn't close. It pivoted. Declan's name moved from a state representative to subject of inquiry in the time it took Agent Solano to read a forged notarization date against a hospital admission record. The second move was quieter. Renata contacted the business broker handling the Hartwell sale and introduced Axiom Bridge LLC as a competing buyer. No names attached to the LLC. Clean capitalization. A letter of intent was submitted 48 hours before the broker's internal deadline for competing offers. Cole Weston's team would be notified that there was another party at the table. The sale wouldn't collapse. It would just slow down enough to require a formal closing meeting with all parties represented, which meant Declan would have to sit down across from whoever Axiom Bridge sent. He had no reason to think that would be a problem. I spent the last 3 days before the dinner doing nothing. No calls, no emails, no movement could be felt. Declan was 3 weeks from what he thought was the finish line. I needed him to be relaxed, confident, completely unprepared for a Tuesday morning. So I let him have the weekend. The dinner was Declan's idea. He'd framed it as a family gathering, nothing formal, just people coming together. Nora's good dishes out on the table. The kind of evening that felt organic, unless you understood what it was actually celebrating. He'd invited 14 people, cousins, Nora's sister, Roy, my father's old business partner, who showed up in a sports coat and brought a bottle of wine that probably cost more than his first truck. Nobody invited me. I came anyway. Through the back with Renata's associate, a quiet man named Joel who had eaten half his salmon before anyone at the main table noticed there were 2 extra people in the room. By the time anyone processed it, Declan was already mid-sentence, and the social cost of interrupting felt too high. So nobody did. That's the thing about confidence. It makes the people around it complicit. Declan was at the head of the table in my father's chair. Holt Mercer's chair, the one with the slightly uneven back leg that my father had refused to replace for 20 years, because he said it kept him from getting too comfortable. Declan had gotten it reupholstered. Dark leather, clean stitching. The chair looked expensive now and looked nothing like my father. The speech started around 9. He didn't announce it as a speech. He just stood up with his wine glass and let the room go quiet the way rooms do when the person standing has trained them to. He thanked Nora for the food. He thanked Roy for making the drive. He mentioned Hartwell Logistics Group by name. What we've built, what we've protected, and the word we landed in my stomach as something dropped from a height. He talked about legacy, about how Holt would have wanted the company to grow beyond what one family could hold, about how the upcoming transition was not a loss, but an evolution, about sacrifice, the word sacrifice delivered with his chin slightly down and his eyes slightly wet, the way he'd been doing it since he was 19 and learned it worked. Nora was crying softly by the time he raised his glass, to Hartwell, to Dad, and to new beginnings. 14 glasses went up. I didn't raise mine. He found me 3 seconds later. His eyes moved across the room, the way they do when you're scanning for approval, and instead, find something that stops your breathing. His glass stayed up for 1 extra second, suspended, and then lowered slowly. He didn't say my name. He didn't say anything. He just looked at me the way a man looks at something he was certain he'd already buried. I looked back at him the way you look at someone when you've already won, and the only thing left is mourning. Then, I picked up my water glass, took a sip, and looked away first. Let him sip with that all night. The closing meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. Declan arrived at 8:50 in a suit I didn't recognize. Charcoal, well-fitted. The kind of thing you buy when you're trying to feel like the version of yourself you've always believed you deserved to be. Pierce Hadley was beside him, leather portfolio under one arm. The easy posture of a lawyer who considered this appointment a formality. Cole Weston was already seated across the table with 2 members of his acquisition team and a paralegal who hadn't looked up from her laptop since they'd arrived. The conference room was on the 14th floor of a building downtown. Glass walls, city view, The kind of room that makes transactions feel inevitable. Renata and I were in the lobby at 8:45. We didn't go up until 9:02. The elevator opened onto a carpeted hallway, and I walked it the way my father walked every room he ever entered, without announcing anything, without adjusting to the temperature of other people's expectations. Renata was half a step behind me. She was carrying a single folder, cream-colored, thin. Everything that mattered fit inside 11 pages. The receptionist outside the conference room stood when she saw us. Renata said, "Axiom Bridge for the Hartwell closing." The receptionist looked at her list, found the name, and opened the door. I walked in first. Declan saw me before anyone else registered what was happening. His face did something I don't have a clean word for. Not shock exactly, because shock implies the possibility was somewhere in his mind. This was closer to the expression of a man whose understanding of physics has just been quietly revised. His mouth opened slightly. His hand, which had been resting flat on the table, pulled back toward him like the surface had changed temperature. Pierce Hadley looked at Renata, then at me, then at Renata again. Cole Weston leaned back in his chair slowly and crossed his arms. He'd done enough acquisitions to recognize when a room had just become a different kind of meeting. Renata set the folder on the table and opened it, without sitting down. Axiom Bridge LLC is a holding entity with a single authorized principal, she said. That principal is Zane Mercer, sole registered owner of Hartwell Logistics Group, under the original incorporation filed by Holt Mercer. I have the original document here, a certified copy filed with the Secretary of State's office yesterday morning, and a letter from the IRS confirming that the estate designation attached to this business has been flagged as fraudulent and is currently under active investigation. She slid 3 copies across the table. One to Cole Weston, one to Pierce Hadley, one to the center of the table, directly in front of Declan. Declan didn't touch his copy. Pierce Hadley picked it up, read the first page, and set it back down with the careful movements of a man calculating how quickly he could exit a building without appearing to run. Cole Weston's paralegal closed her laptop. "We're going to need to pause this," Cole said quietly, not to Declan. To the room. The room agreed. Declan's jaw was tight. His shoulders were up near his ears. He was looking at the copy in front of him. The way you look at something you need to appear calm about, while every system inside you is failing simultaneously. He tried once. "This is a misunderstanding," he said. "Zane and I had an agreement, a verbal agreement, about the structure of..." "There's no verbal agreement that supersedes a registered incorporation," Renata said. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "And there's no verbal agreement that explains a power of attorney notarized while your brother was in a coma." The room went completely silent. Cole Weston stood up, buttoned his jacket, and extended a hand to his paralegal. "We'll be in touch through counsel," he said, and walked out with his entire team behind him like a tide going out. Pierce Hadley leaned toward Declan and said something low that I couldn't hear. Declan wasn't listening. He was looking at me. I let him look. Then I said the only thing I'd prepared to say in that room. Not a speech, not an accusation. Just the line he'd used at the memorial dinner, the one he'd delivered with his glass raised and his eyes wet while our mother cried into her napkin. "To new beginnings," I said. And then I picked up Renata's folder and walked out. The call from Nora came 4 days later. Not an apology. I want to be clear about that because I think people expect the story to end with a mother weeping on the phone, telling her son she should have known better, and she's so sorry, and can you ever forgive me? That's not what happened. Nora called and asked questions. Careful, measured questions, in the voice of a woman who had built a version of events in her mind over several years and was now holding it up against new light and watching pieces of it become transparent. She asked if the power of attorney was real. I told her no. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "He cried when he told me you might not wake up." I said, "I know." She didn't say anything after that for almost a full minute. I didn't fill the silence. I'd learned by then that filling silence was how you let other people off the hook too early. Eventually, she said she needed some time. I said that was fine. It was fine. It was going to take as long as it took, and I wasn't going to perform forgiveness I hadn't reached yet, or demand an accounting I wasn't ready to sit through. Nora had been manipulated by someone she trusted completely. That was real. Her grief over my father had been used as a lever. That was also real. Neither of those things made what she'd accepted without question painless, but they made it something I could eventually work with. Eventually, Declan retained a new lawyer 3 days after Pierce Hadley quietly withdrew from the case. The new lawyer sent Renata a letter suggesting a negotiated settlement, a figure that was insultingly low and structured in a way that would have required me to sign away my right to pursue the fraud case further. Renata forwarded it to me with a single line of commentary. "They're scared. We didn't respond for 11 days. Then Renata sent back a counter that outlined exactly what we intended to pursue. Full restitution, recovery of the skimmed funds with interest, and formal cooperation with Agent Solano's investigation, and noted that our willingness to negotiate had a shelf life. Declan's new lawyer stopped responding after that. Agent Solano's investigation moved the way federal investigations move. Slowly, methodically, without drama. There were no cameras, no courtroom moments. Just a process grinding forward with the weight of documentation behind it, and a subject who had run out of people willing to stand next to him. I went back to Hartwell Logistics Group on a Monday morning in November, not with a speech, not with a plan to make it feel significant. I just drove to the building, parked in the spot my father had always used, the one closest to the loading dock, not the front entrance, because Holt Mercer believed you entered a business through its working end, and went inside. Some of the staff had stayed, the ones who hadn't known, the ones who'd just been doing their jobs while everything above them was on fire. They looked at me the way people look at someone they'd heard conflicting things about and were now recalibrating in real time. I didn't explain myself. I didn't address the last 2 years in a company meeting or send a memo about fresh starts. I just sat down at my father's old desk, the one Declan had moved into the corner office, the one with the reupholstered chair that no longer looked like anything Holt Mercer would have sat in, and I started working. The chair was wrong, so I replaced it with the plain one from the conference room. The numbers were a mess, so I called Felix, and we spent 3 days going through everything line by line. The client relationships were strained but not broken, because Declan had been good at the front end. I'll still give him that. And the clients had liked him right up until the moment they heard through their own counsel that the company's ownership was under legal dispute. I called each of them personally. No spin. Just facts and a timeline, and an offer to earn back what the situation had cost them. 3 called back the same day. That was enough to start. Hartwell Logistics Group didn't recover overnight. It didn't recover in a month. There were weeks where the gap between what the business needed and what it had felt like standing at one edge of something wide and staring at the other side. But the gap was real, not manufactured. The debt was clean, not hidden. The problems were problems I could actually solve, instead of problems someone else had created and buried in my name. There's a difference between rebuilding something and just removing what was destroying it. Most of the work wasn't building at all. It was subtraction. The last thing I did on that first day back was take the reupholstered chair, the dark leather one, the expensive one, the one that looked nothing like my father, and put it in the hallway outside the office. By the end of the week, someone had taken it. I didn't notice until Friday afternoon, and when I did, I sat back in the plain conference room chair and looked at my father's desk